Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our panel this morning. My name is Martin Bunton. I am the interim director at the Center for Global Studies. I'm filling in for the year for Oliver Schmidtke, who is on a research leave this year. Our real pleasure at the Center for Global Studies to be able to co-sponsor this event with the School of Public Admin. And I will soon turn it over to the director, Astrid Brussel. But first, if I could say some intros and welcome. We'll start with the land acknowledgement. The school where the Center for Global Studies and both the School of Public Admin, we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasonic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And of course, when we think of historical relationships with the land, it takes on an added poignancy in a discussion such as the one we'll have today, where we'll talk to those suffering under imperialism and occupation. Let me say a few more words of a sort of housekeeping sort to set out today's discussion. We ask that you please keep your videos off and your microphones muted. When it comes to the Q&A, we will ask that you put your questions into the chat function, which will open at that time. And then we will ask, and then Astrid will moderate that discussion. So again, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Astrid to introduce the panel. Thank you.
We are very privileged to be gathered here today during this webinar to learn more about this crisis, but to learn more about Ukraine also and Ukrainian people to better understand this situation. It is my very great honor to introduce today's panelists. First of all, thank you, Mychailo Wynnyckyj, for being with us today. Mychailo is located in Ukraine today. He's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and in Kyiv Mohyla Business School. He has a PhD in economic sociology from the University of Cambridge. He has lived in Ukraine since 2003 and is Ukrainian Canadian. He's been involved in educational reform in Ukraine, serving as advisor in 3 ministries, and until recently head of the Secretariat of the National Agency for Higher Education Quality Assurance. And he has a book published in 2019 on Ukraine's maiden Russia's war, a chronicle and analysis of the revolution dignity. So thank you very much, Mychailo, for being with us today. We also have as a panelist, Serhiy Yekelchik is a UVic professor in German and Slavic studies and history. He has numerous publications on Ukraine, Russia, and European history. And he has a book coming out soon on writing a nation. And finally, we have Tamara Krochenko, who will moderate this panel. Tamara Krochenko is an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration with expertise in comparative public policy and territorial development. She has worked for a number of research institutes in Canada, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan. She has also written books about Ukraine, Awesome Ukraine, Awesome Kyiv, and she has a deep love for her and this country. So I want to thank each one of you for being here today as listeners and as speakers, and it will be over to you now, Tamara.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be convening this panel today, and thank you so much for that introduction, Astrid. So we're really grateful to have Mychailo here because he's joining us from Kyiv, and I've been following his thoughts from Kyiv throughout the crisis, which have been really helping me understand what's going on. So thank you so much, and thank you to Serhiy, who has been, both of you have been incredibly busy doing a ton of media interviews and getting the word out and helping understand and explain the roots of this crisis and what's going on. And I'm just grateful that we can continue this conversation today. I'm going to really start, Mychailo, with a personal question to you. You are Ukrainian Canadian. You moved to Ukraine in 2003. Actually, my father did the same thing, quite like you, but earlier in 1991. And just wondered, could you tell us a bit about what sparked that move and how you've seen Ukraine change in the intervening years? And particularly, I think there's a very specific relationship with diaspora that is important and unique. And if you could just comment on that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to age myself very quickly here. My first trip to Ukraine was in 1989. I was 18, so you can do the math from there. And I was actually not even a first-year university student at the time, but I certainly fell in love with the country. It was still in the Soviet days. This was it may sound very strange, but it was on the one hand, it was very gray and very dark and very Soviet, if you like. But on the other hand, there was something about the people that was very attractive to me as someone who lived in a very individualistic kind of society. I think that that's probably one of the things that really attracts to Ukraine is a certain amount of, I'm not even going to call it collectivism. I think it's more communitarianism. It's this feeling of you are part of something bigger. We're going to be talking, of course, because this is a topic that he has written about, and we're going to be talking about identity, of course, and that's something that is very, I think it's something that permeates Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian society. So in the 90s, I traveled back and forth. During university, I had the opportunity to do a 6-month exchange program in a place called Dnipropetrovsk, which is now called Dnipro. And my supervisor was a fellow by the name of Serhiy Plokhy. Some of you may have heard of that name, who's now at Harvard. And it was a very interesting place at the time. I was actually, like Serhiy Wynnyckyj, I had studied history initially and then switched to other things afterwards. So I mean, there's been always an emotional and an intellectual tie. And then in the 90s, we did some business in Canada, ran a company, and then I decided that it was time to go back into academia. And at the end of the day, to be very honest, as in many cases with expats, there's this French phrase of chercher la femme. In my case, there was a lady that I met as she was studying in the States. At a conference, I met her, and she was moving back to Kyiv, and I decided that it might be not a bad idea to follow her. And strangely enough, she's become the mother of our 4 children. So that happens accidentally, of course. So yeah, so the road to moving to Ukraine was a long one. It lasted, I guess, more than a decade, but the final catalyst, as in many cases, was not only an academic interest, not only an emotional tie, but also the opportunity to start a family. I have not looked back with any kind of regret in any way. I've lived through 2 revolutions and now a war, which sounds a little bit frightening on the one hand, but if you're a person like me who's a little bit entrepreneurial, if you like, and a little bit emotional about things, I wouldn't want to live in another, I don't think that there's another place in the world that would be more interesting to live in. Orange Revolution was first, then we had the Maidan in 2013-14, which ended up, I ended up, that's where I started the Thoughts from Kyiv concept, and that actually ended up in a book. And now we're living through something that's much more frightening because of the fact that certainly I have more responsibilities today with the family, but at the same time, something that is very fulfilling. So yeah. In terms of the links to the diaspora, I will say that one of the things that I find to be absolutely breathtakingly important at this point is that we as Ukrainians recognize ourselves as being a global nation. We are not, you know, one of the things that this war is going to change, I think, is the concept of Ukrainians from Ukraine. In other words, Ukrainian citizens versus diaspora. We are a Ukrainian nation. The Ukrainian nation is a global nation. I think we have a great deal to learn from Israel, which has had a diaspora for a very long time as well. But Ukrainians need to understand Ukraine better. And I think that, and I think, in other words, both sides. And strangely enough, that is being facilitated by people suddenly becoming interested in Ukraine who are not Ukrainians. But I guess growing up in Ontario, I remember there was a joke. There's only 2 types of people in the world, those that are Ukrainian and those that want to be. At the time, it was a joke. I get the impression that now it's kind of become almost reality.
I want to mention that you're joining from your basement because there are still air raids and that you are in the Kyiv region. And I just want to ask you, since you're there, tell us a little bit about what life is like right now. What's the economy look like? In particular, I mean, you're a professor, how are you all working? And I see you guys working incredibly hard, which is astonishing to me that you can keep it up. So just tell us a bit about life.
Well, it's much easier now than it was a month ago, obviously. A month ago, we were in a situation where there was we were hearing explosions on a daily basis. I was actually signed up for a territorial brigade, a local territorial brigade here in the area that we live in. So we did nightly patrols. But I guess at the end of the day, as far as being busy, the important thing is that there's a war on, and there is a mass mobilization happening. Literally everyone is mobilized. I mean, the village that I'm in has a population normally of about 400 people. At the moment, the population has 3 times that, because we've got a lot of people that have come from Kyiv, where Kyiv was certainly under threat, and moving into from an urban area into a rural area was considered to be much more of a safe haven. And so dachas have become sort of places of life, or cottages, if you like. We had 2 families staying with us for the first 3 weeks, which meant that we were very, very tight in terms of space. 2 other families that did not have dachas, and they were coming from areas that actually had rocket attacks. In one case, their apartment block was actually destroyed, so they have no place to go back to at the moment. And in the other case, the bombing was very, very close, so they needed to evacuate. And we tried to give them shelter for a little while. I think the expectation was that was going to be a very short period. That turned out to be, when it became obvious that it was not going to be a temporary thing anymore, those 2 families moved on. One has moved on to Western Ukraine, where they have family, and the other has actually moved. They actually drove, believe it or not, to Greece, which is a hell of a drive. So territorially, anyways, so in terms of distance. But things have quietened down now, because the Russians have been pushed back from Kyiv, from the north of Ukraine, and the war has now moved east and south. We are still apprehensive because there are periodic attacks and continuing periodic attacks on urban centers, and that could include Kyiv. So we are at the moment still deciding to stay at our country house, not going back to the capital, or if we do go into the capital, then sort of do a day trip and stay overnight here. But school has restarted, which is good. Strangely enough, COVID helped. Because if this war had happened 2 years ago, the infrastructure for online learning would not have been here, would not have been in place. Now, kids have gotten accustomed to the fact that classes are online. I'm teaching online. My students, I have in my class, I have 28 students. 6 of them are actually on the front at the moment in the armed forces. So obviously they're not attending classes. Of the 22 that are left, I have approximately, I think it's 6 or 7 that have left the country. They're either in Poland or in Germany, or in Poland and Germany, and primarily, I think one is in the UK, and they are logging on. And the rest are either in Kyiv or with their families somewhere in other places of Ukraine. But teaching is 100% online. We had a long pause in our academic year. The pause was 5 weeks, but we've started it up again, and we've just basically extended the school year now. Instead of ending in June, we'll end in July. But nevertheless, we're continuing as well as we can. Keeping busy is very important. People are dying on the front, and people are fighting for this country. And the least we can do is do our jobs, because at the end of the day, that's what they're fighting for. And they're fighting for our freedom and for our, I mean, the country is fighting for its survival. And Ukrainians are fighting for their survival. So it's not just about military, hostilities and artillery fire and territorial brigades and infantry advances and all that. It's about continuing to make the country work. And that's something that's very important, because if the country doesn't work, then it becomes a question of what are we fighting for?
I hear that from everyone. Yeah, all hands on deck to keep things going. And my sister runs a small business, and from her perspective, she's Ukrainian. She has an obligation to keep the economy going too. I hear that a lot from people. So I want to start off with a big question, which is, what is Ukraine as a nation? And I kind of, describing what I wanted to achieve in this talk today is thinking about persistence and resilience. And it's really a long history, but I'll start maybe with asking Serhiy, going back a little bit later in history, and then ask you, Mychailo, about more modern history. But Serhiy, in your book, A Modern History of Ukraine, which is a great read, by the way, I have it here, you emphasize really understanding different histories. So there's an imperial history, there's a history that comes from rulers and empire, and then there's a very separate history of the people of the land. And could you explain a little bit what you meant by that and what that means for Ukrainian nationhood? In particular, how have Ukrainians maintained a common identity? Because when you read your book, it's an incredibly fractious history, right? And I just want to also plug that Serhiy has this book, The Conflict in Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know, that came out in 2015. It's just such a great primer to understand what's happening today. So Serhiy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. And like Mychailo, I've spent much of the 1990s traveling between Canada and Ukraine, actually Australia and Ukraine as well, in the early 90s, and thinking about what Ukraine is and how to define Ukrainians. And this resulted in that particular book that Tamara has just been showing you, which has the main argument of a very interesting nature, that Ukrainian history has prepared the development of a nation state, that Ukraine has emerged as part of the Ukrainian national project, with ethnic Ukrainians claiming rightly their right to self-determination and to governing their own land and their lives. But in the 20th century, as Ukrainian statehood evolved, it was no longer possible, really, and especially in the Ukrainian case, because of multiple legacies of imperialism, resettlements and such, it was, of course, not possible to create an ethnically pure Ukraine, and no movement really ever tried that, which is very important to understand, because one of misconceptions about Ukraine is that Ukraine was created and perhaps still run by kind of Nazi-type ethnic exclusivists who only want to empower ethnic Ukrainians. But it's the irony of Ukrainian history that the Ukrainian state developed based on the very strong claim that Ukrainians must have their own state. But the way it was created as a democratic and multi-ethnic state. And that was the case from the very start of Ukrainian statehood in the 20th century. In 1917, when Mikhailo Hrushevsky writes articles about free Ukraine and who are Ukrainians and what they want, he makes it very clear almost every time at the start of the article that this is what we are going to do to the minorities, because we have been a minority for so long in an empire, and this is how we are going to treat the minorities in independent Ukraine. And so it is then a product of the national idea, a product of the national struggle, historically, the struggle which was against the empires, but yet it produced, and not just in the 21st century, but also already in the 20s, the notion of Ukraine as a land populated by various people. And this is really important, of course, to stress that in the 1990s, as Ukraine was entering the decisive moment of defining itself culturally and historically as an entity, it already had one important example to the West. That was the example of Europe. Europe developing as the European Union and increasingly including into its orbit of gravity, the states of the so-called former Eastern or East Central Europe. And what was happening in this, as was taking place, and I'm sure many of you know because the European studies are very well represented here at UVic and at the Center for Global Studies too, Europe was in fact having an influence on the kind of statehood and cultural ideas of the nation and historical ideas of the nation as they were developing in the countries recently liberating themselves from the Soviet yoke. And so this European influence at first could be controversial, but eventually it became quite productive. And that was the understanding of the new nations of Europe as civic nations, political communities which define themselves by the respect for the titular people of the state, but obviously a full recognition of the rights for everybody else, and also the recognition of those groups like the Crimean Tatars who had suffered genocide in the hands of the empire, and for that reason in particular are now welcome as an important component of Ukrainian history. Also historically, it's very difficult to do because you cannot really narrate the history of the early modern period in Ukraine without talking about the Cossacks growing to prominence as the force which protected Ukraine against the Tatar raids. And yet, Ukrainian historians have now managed to reconcile this with an affirmative and important statement that Ukraine is also the homeland for the Crimean Tatars, whether or not Ukraine controls Crimea, but the Crimean Tatars are forever part of our political nation. So this is then a very interesting combination of what you might see as a pre-modern notions when Ukrainian identity is defined by religion, by the understanding that we are locals, by the understanding of who we are not. We are not the dominant people of the empire. But then Ukraine becomes in 1917 an important example of a new nation building, a European and democratic nation building. And it's important to stress that this tradition continues for 100 years now. And of course, I'm sure all of you know that the most recent revolution in Ukraine, and I still remember the revolution on the granite and the end of the Soviet Union. Those were also interesting moments for me as a student and graduate student in Kyiv. The most recent revolution, the revolution of dignity, which resulted in the Russian aggression against Ukraine, of course, only underscored the notion of Ukraine today as a nation which defines itself politically. And that is, of course, the fact that it was started with a Facebook post. Some now say several Facebook posts by different people, but of course, those who ended up written in the history are Facebook posts by Mustafa Nayyem, the Afghan Ukrainian journalist, and I do use it in my lecturing quite a bit to indicate that that was not an ethnic nationalist radicalist movement. And of course, the most recognizable face of those who died at the Maidan is that of an Armenian Ukrainian, and Ukraine now has a Jewish president. And that's the kind of Ukraine which was produced by all those consecutive revolutions taking place ever since the end of the Soviet Union. So interestingly, even so, the most recent elections of 2019 resulted in Zelensky winning on the program of going back somewhat from what the Revolution of Dignity was all about. He himself is a product of this revolution, whether he realizes it or not. And the very possibility for him to be elected is the result of those processes of defining the Ukrainian nation as a political community. And I think there is no way of going back now. Mychailo has started by talking about territorial defenses. There is no way now, really, to take back the power from the people, which may sound a bit pathetic and a bit kind of, too as a literary stamp, as a convention, but that's what it is, in fact. You cannot take power away from the people. It is in the hands of the people now, very literally, because these people are united as volunteers, as soldiers, as delivery drivers, as intellectuals fighting in the hybrid conflict. So that's not the Soviet type of, you know, power in the hands of the people. That's not a metaphor from the Soviet past, which would have been unfortunate. It's actually a very real and very new way of defining who we are. And like Mychailo, I'm, of course, constantly concerned about what comes next if we do win this war. Will the territorial defenses help us somehow to control the corruption, right? To deal with the oligarchic rule? And that's the big question for the Ukrainian future. But in order for this future to happen, there is a struggle to be fought right now.
And I'm going to ask you about that. I will. The future. First, I'd like to ask Mychailo, as a sociologist, the same question: what is Ukraine as a nation? And particularly since you wrote the book Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, a chronicle and analysis of the Revolution of Dignity, which, by the way, this is the photo behind me. You probably recognize it. It's the Christmas tree in Maidan Nezhelesnosti at the time of the revolution, when the Ukrainian flag was hoisted up, where this all happened. So I just wanted to ask, you know, you've closely chronicled this. How was that foundational to identity today?
Thanks, Tamara. I think that Serhij's historical context was very important. And I think that what I try to do in that book, actually, I have a chapter that talks about the identity revolution and something that was obviously ongoing in Ukraine in 2013-14 that was certainly not recognized. Just before today's talk, I actually listened to I mean, it's one of the things that you try to do as an academic is try to keep up with things that are going on outside of Ukraine, because in Ukraine it's easy to keep up with things that are going on, for me anyway. Much more difficult outside. And Volodya Kulik, who is a very well-known Ukrainian academic from Kyiv, now in Berlin, as I understand it, or perhaps he's in Kyiv, I'm not sure, but the talk was organized out of a center in Berlin. And he was talking about the fact that the Ukrainian identity, how it has changed in the last 10 years and the extent to which it has changed. And I think that I actually put up a post today where I reference some sociological data, some polling data. We have this stereotype in the literature about Ukraine being a divided country, supposedly linguistically divided. So people prefer to speak Ukrainian or a version of Ukrainian more closer to Ukrainian because it's a sort of a pidgin. We call it surzhyk, pidgin Ukrainian and mixture of pidgin of Ukrainian and Russian, but more Ukrainian in the north and west and more Russian in the south and east. And that was interpreted by a lot of people as being a foundational divide. That's, you know, sort of the creation of if you like, two poles between Ukraine, and the poles were defined as being Lviv and Donetsk. So Lviv being 99% Ukrainian speaking in the west, and Donetsk being perhaps 99% Russian speaking in the east. Yeah, and these two Ukraines that were divided, etc. And that was part of the discourse. And I think that it's very important to understand that discourse, that perception of Ukraine, first of all, already in around 2010, 2011, historian Yaroslav Hrycak came out and said, I would much prefer not to talk about 2 Ukraines, but 22 Ukraines, because Ukraine as a big country has many, many regions, and regional diversity, I mean, I'm talking to Canadians, regional diversity is part of being in a big country, right? Victoria is obviously different from Toronto, and from Montreal, and from Winnipeg, and from, I mean, we can name a whole bunch of cities, and obviously regional diversity will be part of the Canadian mosaic. It's the same thing in Ukraine. I mean, it's a country of 40 million people, and obviously regional differences will be there. How does that bring together in an identity? Well, the interpretation was that language is extremely important. And I think that Kulik's message today was really good. And that is that we have survey data that now talks about the fact, not what language do you prefer to speak on a daily basis, and not who do you identify yourself as in terms of ethnicity, because those are both really problematic questions. But what language do you consider to be your mother tongue? And the fascinating thing that has happened over the last 10 years is that if in surveys in 2012, we were seeing approximately 55, 57% of people saying Ukrainian. By 2022, that number was up to 80%. In other words, in a 10-year shift, people have started saying in surveys that their mother tongue is Ukrainian. Now, that does not mean that they speak Ukrainian on a regular basis. That does not mean that the language of interaction in Kyiv or in Dnipro or in Odessa or in Kherson is going to be Ukrainian. But the identification is not with ethnicity. And that's very important because ethnicity, as Sadim actually pointed out very, very well, ethnicity is really problematic in this country. I mean, are you ethnic Ukrainian? Are you ethnic Russian? Are you ethnic Jewish? Because in this part of the world, Jewish is an ethnicity in addition to being a religion. Are you ethnic Bulgarian in the South? Are you ethnic Hungarian in the West? Do you have Polish roots? It's very, very mixed. Language does define identity, but it's not necessarily language of everyday use. It's what you identify yourself as your mother tongue. And that is something that has revolutionarily changed in the last 10 years. So now obviously, it's not a question of in the last 10 years, 30% remember suddenly that their parents spoke Ukrainian. They identify as their mother tongue, as their native language, as being Ukrainian. That's an identity construct, if you like. And that's something that I think that the identity of Ukrainians is very much was under construction for the last 30 years. I think that one of the things that the Russians, strangely enough, with their invasion have done is they've completed that construction. Ukraine today is a consolidated, I'm not convinced that I like the term civic identity. As someone who's done a lot of reading of Anthony Smith and Ernest Gellner and others, I'm not sure that I like that statement because it's about loyalty to institutions and about loyalty to the state and about loyalty to those types of things. And I'm not sure that's what we're about. But it's certainly about loyalty and valuing a territory. In other words, the map is very important as a symbol. Obviously, the flag, etc. I will perhaps shock a lot of people that are from outside of Ukraine that are looking at the news, etc. Zelensky is not identified as being the pillar of Ukrainianism. He's not the symbol of Ukraine. He's not particularly popular, incidentally. I mean, he is popular in terms of people believe that what he's doing in the last 2 and 3 months has been the right thing. But we need to understand that prior to the start of the war, his approval rating was at around 22%, which is not exactly very high. What will happen after the war, we shall see. People have obviously loyalty to the president because he's running the show in terms of the war. But what happens after hostilities end, we will see. The point is that it's not a civic identity in terms of being a political identity of association with the state necessarily. It's an association with a construct of society. For those of us that read a lot about this, it's about an imagined community. Pardon my Benedict Anderson, but yeah, it's about imagining yourself as being part of a community, and whether that's real or not is completely irrelevant. Yes, language is important, and this is where I want to say something, going back to your question, Tamara, about diaspora. One of the major conflicting points between the diaspora and Ukraine in the past has always been this issue of language, where we were taught in the diaspora that we need to preserve the Ukrainian language because in the Soviet Union, the Ukrainians are being Russified. That was the myth that we were brought up with. And I think that the fact that after independence happened, that suddenly we found out that a lot of Ukrainians don't speak Ukrainian on an everyday basis, was an issue that sort of moved the diaspora and Ukraine in separate ways. I think that language issue is going to become much less of an issue today. Unfortunately, I think that in the last 30 years, we may have lost some of the Ukrainian language in the diaspora. And that's a process that we need to work on. So language is important, but I don't think that it is the defining thing, nor do I believe that language is something that is very often portrayed in the Kremlin-sponsored narrative as being divisive. language is not a divisive issue in Ukraine, but it is something that but it is a point of coalescence for today's identity that is now no longer divided. The myth of a divided Ukraine, thankfully, is something that we can certainly turn the page and say that's yesterday, and we're no longer about that. It's very much consolidated. Now the question is, I guess, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But I'm convinced that it's certainly much better than bad. More good than bad. I apologize.
Great. I want to ask you, related to all of this, both of you, something, really about the modern Ukrainian state and what kind of state building and reform has taken place. And I would say not always successfully. So as someone who's long followed Ukrainian politics, I'll totally admit my gross frustration with successive bad governments, with fistfights in the parliament. It has been chaotic, and it's chaotic in the sense because there's no, unlike in Russia, there's been no central consolidation of authority. There's a whole bunch of people kind of fighting, right? But you can describe this better than I. And yet one can also say that there's something somewhat resilient in that structure, maybe. And so in order to think also of what this war is doing presently to the Ukrainian state, just what has modern Ukraine built? Because even in the last 5 years, there have been some really important reforms, anti-corruption reforms, major decentralization reforms, and kind of framing this within the narrative of resilience. What do you see as some of those achievements and challenges, actually?
I assume that's a question to me because I get the impression that Tomato's read some of the things that I've been writing, and so that question is kind of it's kind of a loaded one. As a sociologist, I can talk about organizational structures and social structures till I'm blue in the face, and I really enjoy this sort of thing because I think that this is really what Ukraine's contribution to. I would even say I'm going to be really, perhaps in Ukrainian we say pafosny. In other words, help me with that. Perhaps grand narrative type. I think Ukraine's contribution to global civilization, if you like, in this war, is showing how leaderless agency can work. In other words, there's a wonderful book which is actually not sociological. It's written by a general, a U.S. general. It's called Team of Teams, and I think that's really what Ukrainians have shown themselves to be on the battlefield, in the volunteer movement, in everything that has to do with mobilization. It's not about hierarchy. It's about putting together an idealistic, if you like, team. In other words, a group of people that have a common goal, a common idea, a common vision, and they go for it. Now, obviously, there needs to be if you like, a leader that comes up and sort of, if you like, verbalizes that vision. And that tends to be, so it's not a completely flat structure. We call it in sociology, we call it heterarchy, right? So we have these temporary leaders that pop up for particular projects. Ukrainians have shown themselves to be phenomenal at that kind of organization. Now that causes all kinds of problems when you want to organize a state around those types of principles, because states tend to be hierarchic, bureaucratic organizations. That's the way, Max Weber, when he talked about the bureaucracy of the nation state, that's what it's all about. It's about creating a hierarchy that is predictable, that is that has certain rules that are set out, et cetera, et cetera. And Ukrainians have shown themselves to be a bit anarchic, but anarchic, I think, in a very positive way. Now, so he's kind of shaking his head because I think we both understand that this is obviously about Cossacks. This is obviously goes back to the roots of, 17th, 18th century Ukrainian history, where it was always about a little bit of anarchy on the frontier. And it was always about getting away from the hierarchy of serfdom and large imperial rule and feudalism. So this is really part of Ukrainian culture that for a long time was considered to be something that we had to somehow overcome. In other words, in order to modernize, in order to become like Europe, in order to become like the West, we have to now get over this anarchy and somehow quash it within ourselves and create these more hierarchical structures. Well, I mean, my attitude towards that one is you can't get more hierarchical than Stalinism. And the Soviet system was about hierarchy. And in Ukraine, in fact, it didn't work very well. So industrialism was something that was forced upon Ukrainians. And I think that we're heading into a sort of a post-industrial society, and which is about teamwork, which is about hierarchy, which is about, things that have been written about creative class and these sorts of things, new types of organizational structures that I think are pretty natural to Ukrainians. And so one of the things I'm writing about at the moment is kind of a parallel, if you like, to Max Weber's Protestant Ethic, where he talks about the fact that the Industrial Revolution started because the Dutch had the right values, and that's where it's sort of the structures that were required for entrepreneurship that then created the industrial, or gave spark to the Industrial Revolution. They started from Northwestern Europe because the values were right there and the practices were right there, and he brings that to Protestantism and Calvinism. I guess I'm proposing a parallel, and that is that post-industrial society requires a certain value set. And it turns out, completely by accident, that perhaps not by accident, but by historical accident, I guess, that Ukrainians are good at that kind of team of teams, kind of organizational structure. Now, how do we create a state from that? How do we institutionalize that? I think is a huge challenge, and I think that's something that we need to think about and write about a lot. But I'm glad that I've got an opportunity to do that. But I think that this is to the outside world, it looks like infighting in parliament. It looks like massive. The country can't get itself together. At the end of the day, I guess my attitude to that one is, hey, that's democracy. The alternative is Russia. And I certainly prefer this little bit of chaos that we have in Ukrainian politics to the autocracy and the lack of freedom that the Russians have to endure.
You've just done a lead-in to my next question. So for the sake of time, I want to go there, if you don't mind, Serhiy. And this one is particular for Serhiy because he studies Russia and Russian propaganda, which is just, one of the questions I have is, well, why are they doing this to us? But also the question to you is, what is the ideology of Russia today? Because there's very different propaganda internally and externally. They have different narratives internally for internal and external audiences. Also, there's incredible contradiction. There's a narrative of kind of ethno-fascism tied to the Russian Orthodox Church. And then there's the fact that Russia actually has really diverse ethnicities. All of this seems completely inconsistent. It's an ideology that I find internally like a lie, to me, this, but tell me if I'm wrong. So what is the ideology of Russia today?
Is it okay if I make a brief point on what you have just, Mychailo, about, about the society and organization? Looking at it as a historian, you would notice that Ukrainians constantly get disillusioned with leadership. I still remember that President Leonid Kravchuk looked so good coming into office, and people are still arguing what if a representative of National Democratic Forces, Vyacheslav Chornovil, was elected. What would have happened of Ukraine then? And of course, in the 20th century, that's one thing. Now in the 21st, we had people thinking, okay, let's elect a billionaire, Petro Poroshenko, who is also patriotic. That should be good. Let's elect a comedian. Maybe a comedian would be good. And of course, the mayor of Kyiv is a heavyweight boxer. And you almost feel like the society just constantly gets disillusioned in leadership because the society does have some perhaps vague idea, but it knows how to do it. It knows how to organize itself because it's shown every time during the revolution and the war, but it does not translate in effective leadership, it seems. And of course, also, it looks like the Ukrainian leaders do not know how to sell themselves. And Leonid Kravchuk was the last one really who knew how to sell himself very well, especially in the diaspora when he went abroad. And not so much in Ukraine, but really Poroshenko, I don't think, has received credit for all of these reforms, even within Ukraine, let alone abroad. We had the talk by Anatoly Kruglashov, a prominent Ukrainian political scientist from Chernivtsi, who came to Victoria to talk about the administrative reform in Ukraine, the local self-government. And it came as a total revelation to us, because if you were to read the news, your impression would be it's a complete disaster, but no. So these reforms were not really effectively. And of course, we need to acknowledge, I think, that Zelensky has changed too with the war. Right? He is no longer the same Zelensky who was struggling, and he will not be the same Zelensky ever again after the war. So what comes after the war is very important. And I think one possibility of reconciling Mychailo's powerful argument about society being able to do it, but in a chaotic way, perhaps, but really workable way, and the institutions not being able to do it, is in fact the further development of society in Ukraine. The greater involvement, there are various ways, of course, of involving society into the government of the state. There are models in Scandinavia that may perhaps be worth looking at, in which you don't really need that many state officials because people agree on the way it needs to be done. So there doesn't have to be, an official present because people would do it anyway. And it's in a way also reconciles these two things because it harkens back. I wasn't thinking about the Cossacks, Mychailo. Of course, every Ukrainian is thinking about the Cossacks all the time, and about various controversies that come with the adoration of the Cossacks too, like the destruction of the state. Most notably, some historians now argue that the Cossacks actually destroyed the existing structures of Ukrainian elites representing the Ukrainians and such. I was thinking about Mychailo Drahomanov, perhaps one of the most underappreciated thinkers in Ukrainian intellectual history, whom a very prominent historian, Ukrainian-Canadian historian, Ivan Lysiak Rudnitsky, considered the forgotten name, the one to which Ukrainians should really go back to, because Drahomanov was thinking about European Union before the idea of European Union was born. He was thinking about the way self-governing communities could be organized. And so we define him as an anarchic socialist or something like that. But a really interesting figure, even for the 19th century Russian Empire and for the 19th century Austro-Hungarian Empire, none of them could make sense of him. He never really fit. And he doesn't, of course, fit into the present day either, just like no Ukrainian leader ever fits and is ever popular for a long time. But I think there is a way, there should be the way. After all the sacrifices, after territorial defenses, after everybody donating as much as they could donate, and the entire communities around the world joining the efforts, like my neighbor across the road here in Mount Duck is going to host a Ukrainian refugee family because he can. He has this little mortgage helper. So it's the global thing. It's no longer limited to Ukrainians too. I do have some hopes. I do. But Mychailo will need to write another book about that. And also, of course, this is even more so important because of the nature of the enemy Ukraine is facing. And of course, we have to be very clear that it's not just Ukraine that is facing this enemy. I constantly confess to reading the Russian press in the morning. I still do. I need it for work. It sometimes makes me terribly depressed or angry and very focused on something, which sort of works well for presentations and writing articles. But the reality is that I don't really find the internal and external narratives, Tamara, to be all that different, and that really what bothers me. It may well be the source of Ukrainian strengths here, because it seems that the Russian elites do indeed believe their own propaganda, because otherwise they would not have done what they did at the start of the war, sending small groups of paratroopers on helicopters to take over Kyiv, which is completely ridiculous if you think of it. But if you do assume that Ukraine is a fake state, then it makes sense to try that first before the actual troops approaching the cities. And so the Russian theory is, of course, that it's not Ukraine that they are fighting. It's the NATO, it's the West more generally, it is the United States. And this explains what is somewhat incomprehensible to CNN, it seems, when Russian officials make statements about using the nuclear power, the nuclear arms, and they don't actually mean Ukraine. They, in fact, threaten the West quite openly or implicitly. So why would that be? Not because the West supports Ukraine, of course, but because Ukraine is presented in Russia as a representation of the West, as the advanced detachment of the NATO troops that are going to invade. And this is one point in Russian propaganda, which, to my embarrassment, I have to say, I sort of like this point. Not that Ukrainians are going to invade Russia, or we are going to invade Russia, but the fact that Ukraine represents the West in a very meaningful sense. So Putin keeps lying through his teeth all the time, but he lies consistently. It is a paranoid and yet somehow coherent picture of the world. But one thing which they get right in Russia is that Ukraine does represent something that is opposite to Russia. And that is, of course, democracy. And democracy, of course, also is Western. And so that explains this whole Nazi thing. The representation of Ukraine as a Nazi state, a neo-Nazi state, which is completely ridiculous, as you understand the moment you land in Ukraine. But of course, all of us get asked about that like every 5 minutes at various public events and interviews, is of course based on two things that are fairly connected, but not in an obvious way. The Soviet representation, the Soviet image of World War II as the Great Patriotic War, in which the Soviet contribution is completely idealized. No war crimes, no mass rape of German women, no nothing. No executions, no gulag, no transporting the equipment from Nazi death camps to Stalin's gulag, which was actually a historical fact, that they disassembled some equipment from death camps and took it to the gulag, which is quite unbelievable, right? But it's completely denied by Russia, as are the things the Red Army was doing in Germany in 1945 to the German civilian population, and in 1946, and going beyond that. So it's a skewed picture, but it's a consistently skewed picture. It's a picture in which the Soviet Union is equated with Russia, and everything else is equated with the Nazis. And it's important to understand that in the Russian scheme, the West, the allies, are on the Nazi side. And this is, I think, what CNN is not really getting. The West is Nazi as well, because it is with Ukraine, but it was also secretly or openly Nazi in World War II. That's the scheme of history which is explicitly or implicitly suggested in Russian textbooks. The Western contribution is minimized. The various invented and real attempts to negotiate with Hitler and the Axis are aggrandized. And the narrative is actually calculated to make not just Hitler the main enemy, but the Western type democracy. And of course, it comes with the adoration of Stalin, which makes perfect sense, because if you like Stalin, then you approve of Putin. So that's logical. But the trick here, the trick to accomplish, is to make democracy Nazi-like. And that's what they are trying to accomplish in the Russian propaganda. And of course, that clashes with the Russian mythology of Ukrainians not being really a separate nation, either political or ethnic. Because the entire calculation that you drop a few paratroopers in the Pechersk district of Kyiv, and that would be the end, and the troops don't even have to drive all the way to the capital, was obviously based on a calculation that the Ukrainian regime, whichever regime it is, Poroshenko, Zelensky, whoever is in charge, must be artificial and fake, because it is a pro-Western regime. It is a Nazi regime because it is pro-Western, not because of any spurious connection to kind of Nazi collaboration, which is in itself a Soviet mythology as such, right? As I said, Russia is credited with everything the Soviet Union did except for the brutality and killings. But the brutality and killings are implicitly shifted towards Ukrainians, who allegedly did it as Nazi collaborators. Of course, as many of my colleagues never tire of explaining, and Timothy Snyder in particular has taken up this case in Europe, in Austria and Germany. Most Ukrainians fought in the Red Army during World War II. So there is sort of very clear logical disconnect between what Russia is saying and what in fact happened. And then, of course, it comes to the point that the Ukrainian insurgent army, created in 1943 and not in 1941, as the Russian mythology would have you believe, fought both the Nazis and the Soviets. And these things are incredibly difficult to explain, and they have to come with an open discussion of collaboration that took place, if only because Russia completely denies facts and suppresses facts of massive Russian collaboration with the Nazis. The entire Russian army fighting on Hitler's side, the enormous percentage of Russians joining the police on the occupied territories, the Russian involvement in the Holocaust, for God's sake, not to mention everything else. So it does have this inner coherency. It is paranoid, it is delusional, but it is a picture of the world which Russia circulates. And I'm afraid that not only there is a unity between what they project outside and what they project inside, and my depressing reading every morning attests to that, but also it seems that the Russian image of Ukraine is based on that too. So they don't know how to go about it, because it is impossible in the Russian media to speak of Ukrainians resisting. So at first, it was only the Nazis resisting and neo-Nazis resisting. Now they switched to speaking of nationalists resisting. So there is now a distinction in the Russian media between Ukrainians and nationalists. So the people in the territorial defenses, the people in the Ukrainian armed forces, they are all nationalists. And that really fits well with what Mychailo has said about Ukrainian identity these days. It's not really about the language you speak, it's about the recognition of the importance of the Ukrainian language and identity as a democratic symbol, as an anti-Russian symbol. And that's the point our mutual friend Volodya Kulik is trying very hard to put in every article, because that's what we need to explain. It's not about forcing everybody to speak Ukrainian. It's something very familiar to us in the West. It is decolonization. It is acknowledging the historical wrongs and acknowledging that the Ukrainian idea and Ukrainian identity in themselves are associated with democracy. And by the way, this is something Drahomanov thought as well, and Shevchenko.
I thank you. And you have a lot of important work to keep doing, Serhiy, to get this information out there. And one of the questions that I didn't get to was really that scholarship on colonialism and imperialism has completely ignored, Russia as an imperialist force and the way that Ukrainians and others have faced Russian colonialism. And there is just so much work to be done on that. And you look at all the top journals in the field, and it's just totally absent and not understood. We are going to move over to a Q&A session. I really need to fit in one question very, very quickly, if you could give me an answer, is that Canada yesterday, I think, recognized what Russia's doing in Ukraine as genocide. There are mass graves. There are filtration camps set up to root out Ukrainians, as you say, those who are loyal to Ukrainian identity, to shoot them if they show any loyalty, if they have so much as a Ukrainian flag with a picture. Internally, the Kremlin propaganda is openly advocating for the elimination of Ukraine and Ukrainians. They're wiping the mention of Ukraine from textbooks. Yesterday in Krasnoyarsk region in Siberia, the local parliament voted for the expropriation of excessive wheat produced by Kherson farmers. And that is directly the same language that they used during the Holodomor in the 1930s, the genocide of Ukrainians by famine, the same exact terms, word for word. And so we're seeing, apart from everything else, we have to grapple with the fact that this is genocide and that one of the goals is for Ukraine to not exist. I think. This is, how do we as a community comprehend this? How do Ukrainians in Ukraine talk about this now? And the language from Kremlin propagandists, from the article that we saw published, it is genocidal language. It is a language of annihilation. That's my question.
Yeah, Tamara, that wasn't really a question. That was a statement, and all I can do is I can agree with it.
But it is a question. It's how are you comprehending this? How are you facing this?
Look, you face, I think that it's important to understand that genocide can be faced and comprehended after the fact, meaning after it's, not after the genocide is over, but after the killing is done, after the killing stops, perhaps would be the correct way of doing it. I think that the value of what we're doing today and the value of what we're doing in the message that we as Ukrainians are trying to get out is that this war has never been about NATO. It's never been about geopolitics. It's never been about some sort of, legitimate grievances that Putin has with respect to NATO expansion. It is a war that is fostered, that is being fought for the sake of resolving the Ukrainian question. I'm using that terminology because those of us that know something about Mein Kampf know that there was another little man in another capital 80 years ago that was trying to resolve a different question, and he had a final solution. That's what's going on in Ukraine today, or that is what is being attempted in Ukraine today. And I think that one of the things that has happened after Bucha and after, well, we don't even know the numbers, and the horrors of Mariupol have not yet become public, but I can tell you that they are gradually becoming public from the sources that I have. Please expect no less than 50,000 graves, okay? When it becomes public. It's a city of 500,000 people, or population of 500,000 people 2 months ago, that has now been completely annihilated. And what we saw in Bucha with executions, with rape, with all of the things that are involved with genocide was, excuse the expression, small potatoes in comparison to what we're going to see when it becomes public in Mariupol, and it will become public. This is about making sure that the Ukrainian nation does not exist as a separate nation. And this is something that I come back to on a regular basis. The Ukrainian nation consists of 60 million people, not 40 million citizens, 60 million people in the world that identify themselves in one way or another as Ukrainians. Putin wants to make sure that we don't exist. And it's not just Putin, unfortunately. As Serhiy was very correct in saying, it's Russian propaganda that is supported by a very large majority of Russians who do not believe that the Ukrainians have a right to exist historically, currently because they're not Russian, they're anti-Russian, meaning they are the opposite of Russia. Historically, because that is somebody's supposedly, I don't know, delusional myth that Ukrainians didn't, in fact, have any kind of historical right to exist. And at the end of the day, it's because of the fact that without Kyiv, symbolically, Russia is problematic in its own history, meaning that this idea of Kyiv, the mother of Russian cities, obviously that's a myth of Russian national identity, but it's a problematic myth because it's a problematic myth for Ukrainians. As long as Kyiv is in a different country and the capital of a different nation, then who are Russians? And who in fact was victorious in the Second World War? That victory is very important because May 9th is coming up, and that's the symbolic day that still goes back to the Soviet period and is very important for Russians, that the Russians won the Second World War. And as Serhiy mentioned, well, what about all of the millions of Ukrainians that fought in the Red Army? Well, they were in fact Russians, would be the official propaganda. And anybody that says that they weren't, well, is a threat to the Russian identity. So this is very much an existential war. And it's not just about genocidal language. It's about genocide actually being perpetrated. Well, let's just say several tens of kilometers from where I sit at the moment.
To follow up on answering your question, Tamara, actually, I think Ukrainians are, unfortunately, very well prepared to understand the nature of genocide, to see it for what it is, because of all the research and public dissemination measures concerning the Holodomor, the Stalin's state-engineered genocidal famine. So I think Ukrainians understand very well that the Holodomor came after the Ukrainian Revolution. It was an answer to the political project of the Ukrainian nation created by the revolution. And, you know, the things are quite recognizable. There is again a revolution, actually two revolutions in the 21st century, and the Russian answer. And Russia obviously has an identity problem, and as many of us and myself too keep trying to explain to the Western media, but that one somehow is not an easy selling point. That Russia has never came to terms with its imperial past. It remains its imperial present. There is no clear modern nation of what a Russian nation is, other than the empire. And of course, that failure to come to terms with its past can generate a lot of violence, and that's precisely what we see in the Ukrainian case. Some of it is caused by the frustration over the loss of empire, but more of it actually caused by the frustration over the symbolic loss of Russianness. If Ukrainians are not Russians, and as Mychailo said, I mean, you know, it's difficult to acknowledge, of course, for Russians that Ilya Muromets, this, you know, famous knight in shiny armor from the Russian folk tales, actually was a real person who is buried in Kyiv. That's somehow embarrassing. They, you know, took away our wonderful knight, but that's not. It's actually the other way around. The Russians took away the past of Kievan Rus and ancient Ukraine. So there's threats here at various levels, political, ethnic, historical, and the answer to them is very often genocide. And we know by now, as 21st century scholars, that genocides do have origins in colonial dreams. I do teach a course on genocides in Eastern Europe. And we started, interestingly enough, with a documentary about German policies in Africa in the very early years of the 20th century. And the Nazis and the Russian Empire and the Soviets very clearly had colonial dreams in Ukraine. The frustration of colonial dreams is one of very classic, really, symptoms of the genocide to come.
Thank you for this dialogue. Thanks for being here. And we're going to head over. Astrid is going to pose questions that are coming in from the chat.
Thank you very much to the three of you for this very interesting conversation. I think we all learn a lot. We have many questions coming from the chat. First question, could you speak a bit about the Tatars and the Crimea? Is there a future where the Crimea returns to Ukraine?
Why don't you go ahead with that, Sahib?
That's the one which is very difficult to answer, but I think there is a clear answer on one point. There will be one day a future when the Crimean Tatars reclaim Crimea, because we very often see it represented in the Russian media as the struggle between Russians and Ukrainians, and then you get Western commentators saying, but Russians do constitute the majority in the Crimea, why wouldn't they have the right to self-determination? So really the crucial point which is so often missing in these discussions is the fact that Russians became a majority literally overnight, or to be exact, over 3 nights, 3 days and 3 nights in May 1944, when the Crimean Tatars were deported, because prior to that, the Tatars, the Russians and the Ukrainians all had significant representation in the Crimea, but none of them had a clear majority. And historically and culturally, it is in fact the Tatars who are the disadvantaged aboriginal population. So what is hiding behind the claim of the Russian Crimea is in fact yet another colonial genocide. And that's an important point. So it's not the point that, you know, Ukrainians are somehow at war with Russians over the Crimea. Ukraine here is defending the historical and cultural rights of the Crimean Tatars. And yes, of course, the international legal order as well. Its right to the Crimea, which it considers to be a proper historical homeland and the main region of settlement of the Crimean Tatars. So difficult to answer this one. But I think we need to be very clear about the way we pose this question, because the way we pose it may contain an answer in itself already. The answer which destroys Russian propaganda and makes it actually very embarrassing for Russians to cling to the control of the Crimea in the age when Aboriginal populations are treated very differently elsewhere in the world.
Thank you, Sergei. We have another question related also to a reference you made of your book. What is the place of women in the people who have power in Ukraine? You talked about the anarchy model of self-organization, and the question from our participant is it more like brotherhood or also sisterhood? So maybe you want to speak to that, but I would like also to ask the question to Tamara, because we see also strong feminine figures in Ukraine. So over to you, Sergei, and Tamara, and Mychailo would like to hear also your insight from Ukraine, right?
I think it really is the question for Mychailo and Tamara, but let me just say that this morning I received photographs from Warsaw of my long editorial in a Polish journal, which is entitled Poland and Ukraine, European Sisters, which actually stresses the importance of emphasizing the role of women, and the denial of Ukrainians and Russians being brothers, which is, of course, a meme on social media. Ukraine no longer has any brothers. That was the official ideology of the Soviet Union, but Ukraine has some sisters in Europe. And that challenges the patriarchy at 10 different levels. But over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Look, I'm not a gender expert, but I have some very, very close colleagues of mine in my department, Tamara Martsenyuk and Tatiana Kostyuchenko, who actually was a PhD student of mine and has now switched a little bit more into gender studies. But I mean, so I can't comment to the extent that perhaps I'd like to be able to comment, but I will say several things. First of all, there is obviously a gender component and an inequality, gender inequality component to Ukrainian reality. That is, for example, most obviously manifest in the fact that men are currently not allowed, men aged 18 to 60 are currently not allowed to leave the country. Women are allowed to leave the country. So obviously there are some very different rules about that the state has put in place. Some would say that those are logical because the primary defensive, if you like, traditional defensive function is usually a male function, or at least it has been in this culture. Now, having said that, I have a very, very good friend of mine who is, and I'm not going to name her because one of the things that she does is she is a volunteer that does logistical work for the Ukrainian Special Forces. The Ukrainian Special Forces are pretty well gender balanced, interestingly enough. In other words, the elite of the Ukrainian army, the elite special forces tend to have a lot of women in there. So, I mean, those traditional roles of supposedly the men being the defenders and being in the army, in the elite are not being kept to. And certainly in the volunteer movement, we're seeing, I would say, gender parity. Your question was about brotherhood or sisterhood. I don't think that communitarian ethic, which is at the moment at the heart of everything that is going on in terms of Ukraine's mobilization, has a very significant gender component to it, or at least not a discriminatory one. Having said that, the counter argument to that would be, I'm not allowed to leave the country, my wife is. The reality is that there are different rules that are, and now and of course that means that of the 4.5 million displaced people that are currently in out of country out of Europe, or excuse me, out of Ukraine in Europe and in Canada and other countries. 4.5 million is the official figure. Most of those are women, women with children. Whether that's good or bad is I suppose something that I'm not going to comment on, except to say that it's a reality.
And the only thing I'll add to that is that I find Ukraine has incredible leadership from women at every level. And one of the things I'll just mention is that my dad lives in Kyrgyzstan, and his Kyrgyz wife was watching Ukrainian television. And there was a mayor, a female mayor of a town, who was organizing everything, and everyone was looking at her leadership. Everyone was following her orders. She had true authority. And Cholpon just said, what? Ukraine? This would never happen in Kyrgyzstan. What is going on here? And it's just real leadership at every level. It doesn't matter. And women are leaders. And I think that we see that in so many different sectors, and including there are so many women. I've heard the figure that there's more women fighting in Ukrainian military than any other military, and maybe Israel is a comparator, but we see Ukrainian women have incredibly strong leadership roles, and it's amazing, and I uphold them.
Thank you. Another question from Mara Marin. What do you see as the role of this Soviet period in the creation of Ukraine as a political, multinational nation? So, yeah, thank you.
Ukraine is a legal successor of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which was a constituent part of the Soviet Union. So many acts of Ukrainian legislation are based on the fact that it is a legal successor. The Ukraine's claim to its territory is based on this succession. Of course, it would be important to note that it was not accidental that the Soviet Union created a Ukrainian republic. It was an answer to the non-Bolshevik Ukrainian Republic created in 1917, and then another one in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918, and both of them coming together. So it is not really like Lenin was such a benevolent supporter of Ukraine, as Mr. Putin sometimes claims. Lenin and Stalin were responding to the challenge of modern nationalism, to the challenge of a new Ukrainian identity, to the challenge, finally, of the collapsing empires. So Ukraine, the Soviet Ukraine, was an answer to the previous Ukrainian Republic and previous Ukrainian national project. Modern Ukraine inherited many things from it, things good and bad. And some things, we have to be careful when judging them. So obviously there is a good reason to reject the ideology and the oppressive policies of the regime, the genocidal policies of the regime, the assimilatory cultural policies. But we want to keep these people, right? The people who were produced by the Soviet experience. Sometimes you would get Ukrainian opinion makers speak disparagingly of those who came from the Soviet Union, of those who still have the Soviet Union in their heads or hearts. But it's a more complex issue, because all of us really ultimately came from this experience of Soviet Ukraine, both legally and physically. The buildings, the infrastructure Ukraine has inherited, like the heating system, which is mind-boggling to my students to explain, that the heat is produced at the central station, which is one for the district, and then it's transported by pipes huge distances to various residential buildings. So all of this physical and lots of spiritual background is there from Soviet Ukraine. So we must condemn things about Soviet Ukraine. There are plenty of things to condemn. We must also acknowledge that it is in itself an answer to Ukrainian national strivings. And we must be very careful when speaking about the people who came from this background, because these are the same people who are now rediscovering Ukrainian identity and, as Mychailo said, indicating Ukrainian as mother tongue on censuses. So this is a legacy, and Ukraine wants to work with its population. It does not really matter what views they have. if they are not undermining the foundations of Ukrainian state now in war. It is a way of dealing with difficult legacy, as so many European countries have to, really, with monuments, with political views, with conflicts, and our modern understanding of what human rights are, how we treat societies, and what genocide is, should be helpful and constructive in this respect.
If you don't mind, I'm going to just add very, very short comment to what Serhiy said, because that was an absolutely excellent answer. I'll try to do this in a very personal way. I want to note two things, and both of them have to do with the fact that I grew up as in a Ukrainian diaspora family. My parents came to Canada as children during the Second World War, and obviously, growing up in that family, everything that was Soviet was bad, and everything that was Ukrainian was good. And it was a very black and white way of growing up. And I think many of, looking at the names here in the in our audience, I think many of us can relate to that. Having said that, my supervisor during my PhD studies was a fellow that quite frankly was a Soviet apologist. His name was David Lane. And I remember him quoting some facts at one point in a discussion that we had, census data from 1921 to compared to 1991 or 1990, I guess that's if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, the point was that officially in 1921, Ukrainian SSR had 17% of its population were literate. By the 1990s, that number was at 97%, right? So, I mean, obviously there is a positive legacy. Now, my answer to that one was, but at what cost? But nevertheless, there is a positive legacy of modernization that came from the Soviet past. Also, as someone who grew up in the Ukrainian diaspora, I always had very serious problems when I arrived in Kyiv to understand why my friends here, my newfound friends, believed that May 9th was a real holiday. But for them, it was a real holiday because their grandparents, my grandparents, were part of, Divizia Halichina, UPA. This was where I came from. Theirs were in the Red Army, and May 9th was a holiday for them, and it was a very solemn day. Now, that I think is what one of the stories that needs to be told is over the last 30 years, how those two narratives have come together from celebrating victory and from being enemies, which was part of the Soviet narrative. And over the last 30 years, we've created, by the way, again, another, I think, positive aspect of the Poroshenko period, where we are no longer talking about victory and enemies, and we're talking about commemoration. And I think that that's something that's very important. We're commemorating our past, as opposed to trying to interpret it as being victorious or not victorious. In other words, an ideological tool. The difference between us and Russia today is that Russia has retained the Second World War as an ideological tool. Ukraine, we are commemorating that, and I think that's another very strong ideological and identity difference between the two countries.
Thank you. I will ask you one last question, and then we'll close this event. Michael, when you started, Mikhail, when you started presenting today, you said, we are fighting for freedom, for being able to continue to be working and living. I think from an external standpoint, we are very impressed by Ukrainian resiliency, but also by Ukrainian communications. On the other side, there's this big Russian propaganda that is also very powerful. What can we do today to support the Ukrainian nation, to reinforce human rights, democracy, and freedom? What is your message to us that you would like to convey for those of us who are solidary to the Ukrainian nation?
One of the messages, there'll be two levels of answer to that question. The one answer will be political, the other will be social, if you like. The political answer is Ukrainians in Canada, and not just Ukrainians, Canadians. As I flippantly said, there are two types of people in the world. There are the Ukrainians and those that want to be. So those of us that identify with the Ukrainian cause, which I firmly believe is a human cause at this point, it's not a question of a Ukrainian cause. We must recognize and we must pressure and continue to pressure governments. I started off by saying, close the sky. That was my message 2 months ago and a month ago. Today, it's weapons, weapons, weapons. This fight this war cannot be resolved peacefully at this point. This war must be resolved on the battlefields. And that is an unfortunate fact for peace-loving people like yourselves and like myself. It's come as a very, it's a very difficult realization for me. I would never have thought that I would be advocating weapons. As an academic, as a social scientist, I certainly don't believe in that sort of thing. But when you face evil, and an aggressive evil, the only way that you're going to stop it is with force. That is unfortunately something that we forgot over the last 80 years since the Second World War. But that is in fact sort of the Churchillian, if you like. Churchill's answer was evil must be stopped. And that means sacrifice, and that means fighting, and that means doing things that are frankly not particularly palatable particularly for us as academics. So continue the pressure on Western governments, and Zelensky and Kuleba and all of the Ukrainian elite is constantly saying weapons, weapons, weapons. We don't win a war with blankets. The social answer to your question of what can be done is, and this has to do with propaganda, is that the narrative of the Kremlin is always about shifting away discussions from Ukrainian voices. In other words, this is about geopolitics. It's about a territory. It's about, well, why don't we, the latest one was, why don't we exchange some territory for peace? Why don't the Ukrainians sort of agree to the fact that Kherson in the southern part of Ukraine will be Russian controlled, and we will end hostilities and fewer people will die? Well, that's, I suppose, true. Perhaps fewer people will die. But what about the millions of people that live on those territories? They will be persecuted because they are Ukrainian, because they want to live in Ukraine. And so Ukrainian voices need to be heard. It's not about geopolitics. It's not about NATO. It's not about territory. It's about people. And I think that that's something that as academics, I think it's very important for us to constantly return the narrative to, well, what's going on the ground? What are the people saying? What are the stories that we need to document? What are the arguments that are being made by the voices on the ground that are suffering, fighting, valiant? I think those are the things that we can do. We as Ukrainians are looking for a voice. It's one of the reasons that I do what I do, and I think that many of us are doing what we're doing. We are tirelessly trying to get Ukrainian voices heard in the world. Please help us with that.
Thank you very much, Mychailo, for this last message. Thank you so much, Sergey and Tamara, for being here today and organizing this event. Thank you to the Center for Global Studies for leading the organization. And thank you to each one of you for being here. Martin, over to you for the word of the end.
Thank you, Astrid. I wanted to say some rounds of thank yous as well, including to you, both as moderator of today's rich discussion and, of course, as director of the School of Public Admin, the co-sponsor of today's event. But if it was such a rich discussion, if you'll let me repeat some of these thank yous, I'd appreciate that too. To the audience, and thank you all for joining us today. Here at the Center for Global Studies, we have an incredible team, Kayla Klim, Jody Walsh. Thanks for all you've done. And Mychailo and Sergey, we know how busy you are, and we know you're doing all you can to raise these arguments and keep this discussion. Thank you so much for this. but especially to Tamara, who brought this to us some weeks ago and impressed upon us the need to bring these voices from Ukraine. So Tamara, thank you so much we'll keep these discussions going. Thank you, everybody.